Have you ever heard of a powerful army with 185,000 soldiers that was completely destroyed in a single night? This is no ordinary war story. There was no battle, no strategies, no human weapons. It was a supernatural attack carried out by a single angel sent by God. Today, on Spiritual Journey, we will delve into one of the most impressive events in the Bible, the night when the angel of the Lord eliminated 185,000 Assyrian soldiers and saved the people of Judah. Imagine the scene. King Sennacherib of Assyria, one of the greatest conquerors in history, had invaded Judah with his invincible army. He surrounded Jerusalem, threatening to destroy the city and enslave the people. His arrogance was such that he mocked God himself, saying that no God could save Judah. But what he didn't know is that the God of Israel does not allow himself to be provoked, and in a single night, everything changed. Let's find out how this happened and what this story has to teach us today. King Sennacherib of Assyria was no ordinary man. He was a ruthless conqueror, accustomed to seeing nations fall before his invincible army. His reputation was for cruelty and power, and his victories echoed like thunder throughout the land. Now, he had set his sights on Judah and especially Jerusalem. With his large and well-trained troops, Sennacherib laid siege to the city. But he did not come with just swords and shields. He brought with him an even more dangerous weapon: fear. Through his messengers, he sent words as sharp as arrows, straight to the hearts of the people of Judah. His messages were filled with arrogance and contempt. He mocked the God of Israel, saying, "No God of any nation has been able to deliver his people from my hand. What makes you think that the Lord will be able to save Jerusalem?" Sennacherib's words echoed like a dark echo off the city walls. He was defying not only Hezekiah, the king of Judah, but God himself. His threats were clear: surrender or destruction. He even offered false promises of peace, saying that if the people would surrender, they would live in a peaceful life in a distant land. But everyone knew the truth. Sennacherib had no intention of sparing anyone. Meanwhile, the Assyrian army, with its 185,000 soldiers, seemed an indestructible force. They camped around Jerusalem like ravenous wolves waiting to pounce. Inside the walls, the people of Judah trembled. The situation seemed hopeless. But in the midst of their despair, one question lingered: where was God in all of this? As Sennacherib's threats echoed off the walls of Jerusalem, King Hezekiah faced a decision that would define the fate of his people. He could surrender to the feared conqueror, accepting a false promise of peace, or he could trust in the unseen, the untouchable, the God of Israel. Hezekiah chose faith. With a heavy heart, he went up to the temple of the Lord. There, before the altar, he opened the letter containing Sennacherib's threats and spread it before God. His prayer was not a timid murmur, but a fervent cry, full of humility and urgency. He began by acknowledging the greatness of God. "O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth." He began by acknowledging God's greatness. "O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth." Hezekiah did not try to minimize the gravity of the situation. He acknowledged the real danger his people faced. But rather than give in to fear, he appealed to God's justice and faithfulness. "Now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone." There was a deep reverence in his words, but also a holy boldness. Hezekiah was not just pleading for his life or the lives of his people. He was defending the name and honor of the Lord in the face of an enemy who had defied him. At that moment, Hezekiah showed that in times of crisis, the answer does not lie in human strength, but in a sincere search for God. His prayer was an act of spiritual warfare, a cry of faith that echoed in the heavens, and as we will see, God did not remain silent. While the echoes of Sennacherib's threats were still reverberating around the walls of Jerusalem, something extraordinary happened. God, who is never silent in the face of human arrogance, decided to respond, and he did so through his prophet, Isaiah. Isaiah came to Hezekiah with a message that would change everything. It was not a word of condemnation, but of hope. It was a promise straight from the heavenly throne, meant to calm the hearts of the king and all the people of Judah. God said, "Because of your pride and the arrogance of your heart, I will act. I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back by the way you came." But the promise did not stop there. God declared that he himself would protect Jerusalem. "I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." It was a clear statement. The Assyrian army, no matter how large, could not touch the holy city. The Lord not only promised to act, but also assured them that he would do so supernaturally, without the inhabitants of Jerusalem having to lift a single sword. This divine response was a powerful reminder. God does not tolerate the arrogance of those who defy him. Sennacherib had mocked the Lord, but now it was God himself who would respond, not with words, but with action. And as always, he would fulfill his promise. Isaiah's message was a ray of light in the darkness. But what happened next would surpass all human expectations. The angel of the Lord was about to appear on the scene. It was a night like any other for the Assyrian army. The 185,000 soldiers camped around Jerusalem rested confidently. After all, they were the most feared war machine in the world. No nation had resisted their power. Jerusalem, surrounded and isolated, seemed just another easy prey, ready to fall into their hands. But that night, something unseen and powerful began to move. The angel of the Lord, sent by God himself, descended silently. There were no trumpets, no war cries, no clashing of swords, only a divine breath, a supernatural force that swept through the Assyrian camp like a silent storm. As the sun rose, the scene was one of pure terror. The soldiers who, hours before, had been laughing and plotting the destruction of Jerusalem now lay lifeless. All 185,000 men killed in a single night. No weapons had been raised, no battle had been fought. The mightiest army on earth had been defeated by a single angel sent by the God of Israel. Imagine the silence that filled that place. The bodies lying there, the tents abandoned, the victory that turned into defeat in a matter of hours. What seemed to be the end of Jerusalem became the beginning of one of the greatest miracles in history. And so, without any man raising his hand, God showed the world that he is the Lord of hosts. He who mocks him will not go unpunished, and he who trusts in him will never be disappointed. The sun began to rise over the horizon, illuminating the Assyrian camp with a pale, cold light. The soldiers who had survived that night began to slowly awaken, still drowsy. But instead of finding their comrades preparing for another day of siege, they found themselves faced with a nightmare scenario. Bodies were lying everywhere. Faces were frozen in expressions of terror. No sign of a struggle, no marks of battle, just death, silent and inexplicable. What had happened? Who could have done this? Fear gripped the survivors. They who had once laughed at Judah's weakness now trembled before the unseen power that had swept away their army. The news quickly reached Sennacherib. The king, who had boasted of his invincibility, now faced a terrifying reality. 185,000 of his finest soldiers killed in a single night, without explanation, without warning. The mightiest army in the land had been reduced to a handful of frightened men. Sennacherib had no choice. He ordered an immediate retreat. The pride that had led him to defy the God of Israel had now turned to terror. He and his surviving soldiers fled Jerusalem, leaving behind not only the bodies of their comrades, but also the knowledge that they had underestimated the power of the Lord. And so the army that seemed invincible was humbled. The city that was supposed to fall remained standing, and the name of God was glorified before all the nations. Sennacherib, the king who once boasted of his power and mocked the God of Israel, did not escape the consequences of his arrogance. After the humiliating defeat at Jerusalem, he returned to Assyria, but his story was far from over. While worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, confident in his own divinity and power, he was surprised by a treacherous act. His own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, rose up against him. In a moment of betrayal and violence, they murdered their own father, the man who had once commanded the most feared army in the world. The irony was profound. Sennacherib, who had defied the living God, was killed in the place where he sought protection from a false god. He, who had threatened to destroy Jerusalem, was destroyed by those who should have been his closest allies. His death was not just an act of familial betrayal, it was an act of divine justice. The Bible reminds us that God is not mocked. Sennacherib had mocked the one who controls the destiny of kings and nations, and he reaped the rewards of his arrogance. His downfall serves as a solemn warning. Those who rise up against the Lord, no matter how powerful they may seem, will not go unpunished. And so the man who once spread terror throughout the land was reduced to a footnote in history, while the name of the God of Israel endures forever. This story is not just an ancient tale, it is a mirror reflecting eternal truths. First, it shows us the absolute sovereignty of God. He controls all things, from the winds to the hearts of kings. No army, no matter how powerful, can oppose his will. Sennacherib learned this the hard way. Human power is insignificant in the face of divine power. Another lesson is the importance of prayer and faith. Hezekiah, faced with an impossible situation, did not resort to political alliances or military strategies. He humbled himself, went to the temple, and cried out to God. His prayer was an act of faith that moved the Lord's heart. This teaches us that, in the midst of our battles, the first and greatest weapon we have is prayer. Ultimately, this story reveals that God works in surprising and supernatural ways. He does not need armies or weapons to accomplish his purposes. One angel alone was enough to defeat 185,000 soldiers. This reminds us that when we trust him, the impossible becomes possible. May this story inspire us to trust in the God who controls all things, to seek his face in prayer, and to wait for his intervention, even when all seems lost. Just as Hezekiah faced the Assyrian army, we too have our own armies to face, problems that seem insurmountable, fears that paralyze us, challenges that leave us without hope. But Hezekiah's story shows us that we are not alone. The same God who acted powerfully in the past still acts today. When we face the impossible, he calls us to trust, not in our own strength, but in his infinite power. Prayer is still our strongest weapon, and faith is our anchor. God has not changed. He still intervenes in surprising and supernatural ways, even when all seems lost. So no matter what army you face today, cry out to God, as Hezekiah did. He is still the Lord of hosts, and no challenge is too great for him. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched your heart. God miraculously protected his people, defeating an army of 185,000 soldiers in a single night. And he still does the same today. No matter how big your challenge, the God who acted in the past is still in control. Don't let fear or doubt paralyze you. Cry out to God, like Hezekiah did, and trust him. He still moves mountains, parts seas, and defeats invisible armies for those who seek him. If this video inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it with friends who need hope. God still writes incredible stories in the lives of those who trust in him. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Trust him.